Good afternoon in the UK and good evening in India. I'm Jane Falkingham, the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences here at the University of Southampton, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the third of our Pioneers Fireside Chats. Before I introduce our guest and our chair, I just want to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Bindi Shah, to say a few words about the Ramniklal Salanki Pioneers Project. Bindi.
Thank you, Jane. So I'm Dr. Bindi Shah, a sociologist here at the University of Southampton and the project lead for the Ramniklal Salanki Pioneers Project. This project is named after Ramniklal Salanki, a pioneer who started a Gujarati newspaper, Garvi Gujarat, from his home in the 1960s and went on to found a publishing empire, the Asian Media Group, which is now led by his two sons, Kalpesh and Shailesh Salanki, one of whom is with us. The Pioneers Project is a unique project that documents the life histories of British South Asians and recognizes their contributions to the making of modern Britain. This project will disrupt the dominant narratives on immigrant communities in Britain and position British South Asians as integral to the nation. The Pioneers Project is an exciting partnership between the Asian Media Group, the India Business Group, and the University of Southampton, with support from the India Office of UK Research and Innovation. We at the university are very proud to be part of this partnership. And I'm absolutely delighted to announce that we have 10 pioneers who have agreed to take part in our pilot project. They include Neil Basu, whom we'll hear from shortly, and others such as actors, sports stars, community activists, entrepreneurs, those who champion our health, and those who help to govern our country. Our hope is that through the Ramniklal Salanki Pioneers Project, we will truly recognize those who may not have got the recognition they so richly deserve. Recognition in terms of telling the trials, tribulations, and successes in their life stories, but also recognition in academic social science and historical research in how they have played a key role in building modern Britain and how their lives have had an impact on the wider British society. Now that lockdown is easing, we're preparing to bring their life stories to you very soon. And with that, I hand back to Professor Jane Falkingham.
Thank you, Bindi. So colleagues, guests, it's more than a year since the global pandemic struck our shores. And since then we have endured 3 national lockdowns. In India, we're saddened to hear about the 300,000 people that are daily contacting COVID, and the hospitals are starting to be overrun with casualties. Our sincere and heartwarming best wishes go to everyone in India, and we stand by you in these difficult times. These pictures we see on the news remind us how lucky we are in the UK. So while we meet under that shadow, it is just as important to hear the stories which provide us with hope, confidence and inspiration. And today's guest, Assistant Commissioner Neil Basu, epitomises that can-do spirit. Born to an Indian father from Kolkata, who serves as a surgeon with the UK police, and a white British mother who was a nurse in Wales, Neil grew up in Stafford, where he completed his schooling at Walton High School. He later obtained a BA Honours degree in economics from Nottingham University, and since joining the Metropolitan Police Services in 1992, Neil has had an inspiring professional career, holding positions as Detective Superintendent in Territorial Police tackling drugs and firearms crime. As we saw in the pictures, he's had a number of roles, and most recently, he received in 2016, received the Queen's Police Medal for Distinguished Services, and prior to this, he received commendations on numerous occasions for bravery, leadership and detective abilities. In 2017, Neil led one of Britain's high-profile and challenging counter-terrorism investigations of the Kremlin-instigated Salisbury nerve agent poisoning, just close to us here in Southampton. And since 2018, Neil has been Assistant Commissioner responsible for specialist operations. He leads the operational and policy strategies for a range of areas, including terrorism and espionage, investigation of war crime, Official Secrets Act offences, and ensuring security protocols for VIPs, royals, embassies, and Parliament. Colleagues, I ask Barnie Choudhury to continue the conversation.
Jane, thank you ever so much. Ladies and gentlemen, are you in for a treat this afternoon? Look, the guy in front of us is the copper's copper. He's the highest ranking police officer of colour in the whole of the country. And taking that together, his life journey, his career to date is just inspirational. We're going to unpack all that over the next hour or so. Neil, good afternoon to you. Welcome.
Hi, Barney.
So when you were watching your past right in front of you, what ran through your mind just now?
Well, probably what my office told me when they saw some of those old photographs and said, wow, you've aged well, haven't you? That was quite upsetting. And my wife said the same thing.
What, you want that hair, you mean?
Yeah, I thought, thank goodness I didn't meet you 30 years ago. But anyway, after I'd got over that, it is actually quite nice to go back, and some of those photographs have got people on them who've become very, very successful senior officers, and some of those photographs have got people who are no longer with us, and so there was a real mixed emotion. Can I just say on that mixed emotion point, I was watching the news last night when the stories came in from New Delhi and Calcutta, and as you've heard, my father is from Calcutta, and we still have family there, and I've got this horrible moment in my head that people from my family might be watching this or seeing this at some point in the future. And I just want to say it was heartbreaking. And my brother is a doctor who did his internship at the Royal Hospital of Tropical Medicine in Calcutta. And, you know, our roots there and, you know, my father's sort of upbringing there mean, you know, we were just heartbroken watching that news story. So, I know that's not a very uplifting way to start, but I want people to know that we're thinking of them, even though we're thousands of miles away.
And how often do you get to see your cousins and your family back in India? Well,
not for many, many years. So my father took me there when I was 14, my eldest brother was 16, youngest brother was 10, and he worked so hard his whole life, and his money went into his house. So he left India because he wanted space, and the crowds were, he had this image of Britain being a space of green and pleasant lands and lots of room to move and room to breathe. And that's what he wanted when he went. And of course, he couldn't afford to go back for many, many years, and then was working so hard. So it was, he hadn't been back for 21 years when we went to see his family home in the shadow of Howrah Bridge and see our family and so many members of our family. And then my brother, 5 years later, when he was going to university, did his elective there and went, and the family looked after him while he was in, you know, what was a very strange city for boys who'd been born and raised in the potteries. You know? So, you know, unfortunately, I haven't been back. I've been back once, and we didn't get to Calcutta. I went with my wife for a couple of weeks a few years ago, but did the traditional kind of northwest tourist trail because my wife had never been to India and couldn't catch up with the family. And it's a terrible thing, you know, that as you get older, you want to go back and see your roots. So I hope soon I will have more time because I'm reaching the end of my service, and I might be able to make a special trip back there. I mean, obviously, the world is not in that place at the moment.
Yeah. Look, we've got people who are watching this, and anybody who wants to contribute, ask questions, please do so in the chat line. But Neil, let's start first of all of your current role. Just explain to us what it is that you do.
Oh, this is quite complicated. I have one rank and two roles. My rank is assistant commissioner, so I'm one of the 4 assistant commissioners that sits on Cress's management board here in the Met. And I run one of the 4 business groups, and the business group is called Specialist Operations. Hence, I'm known as AXO, Assistant Commissioner Specialist Operations. It's quite a famous title because we're made famous by the shoulders of the giants I stand on, who created this machine called the Counter-Terrorism policing machine. And in London, I'm responsible for all the counter-terrorism activity. So the Counter-Terrorism Command in London, which is by far the biggest in the country, and all its protective security operations. So the policing of the airports, Heathrow and City of London, the policing of Parliament, the policing of all of the diplomatic community and their premises, the royalty and specialist protection that we offer to ministers and members of the royal household who need to be protected, both their home protection and their close personal protection. So that's my responsibility in London, along with some very specialist capabilities in search techniques and CBRN and chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear response, and in the way we advise people who are doing major public events about how they should keep themselves safe from terror. And then my second role is a national role as the national lead for counter-terrorism. So there are 8 other counter-terrorism units in England and Wales around the United Kingdom, plus Police Service of Northern Ireland and Police Scotland, who let's treat those separately from them. And I work very closely with their chief constables and their counter-terrorism teams, but they have responsibility on their geographic patch. In England and Wales, I coordinate the work of the other 8 counter-terrorism units, and chief constables from those regions, in those 8 regions, sit on a board that I chair, and by that, in that way, we control the organisation that is counter-terrorism policing. So if it was a police force, it would be the 3rd largest in the United Kingdom. That's its kind of budget and scale. We don't talk about the numbers publicly, but that's the kind of scale of it. And of course, our job, and we have most national leads in policing because we are 43 different police forces. Their job is to set policy and standards that then the chief constables follow. Mine isn't to do that. Mine is to deliver an operational effect across the United Kingdom. So in my 6 years in counter-terrorism, we have arrested almost 2,000 terrorists. We have charged and convicted nearly 650 of them, and we have 65 more waiting trial. That's what I do for a day job.
And give us an insight in the room. So here you are, you're in charge of looking after the country in terms of counter-terrorism. What are the sort of conversations that your group, your fellow officers might have?
So let me be clear about being in charge of counter-terrorism in the United Kingdom. If my great friend Ken McCullum from MI5, who's fantastic, he's bringing MI5 out of the shadows and he's doing lots of public work, he'd probably be fairly horrified. Of course, I'm his close partner and he has the prime responsibility for domestic security against counter-terrorism. MI5 have had that since the early 20s. They took it off the Metropolitan Police. So, we are incredibly close partners. So the conversations we have are not just police officers sitting around the table, the thing that makes the counter-terrorism machine very special in the United Kingdom is that MI5, policing, and the government all sit around and deliver this thing we call contest, which is the government strategy for counter-terrorism. And I get access to the rest of the UK intelligence community through Ken, and he gets access to all of policing through me. That effect from local to global, because we have officers stationed all around the world, enables us to keep us safe here at home. So the conversation that's going on is how do we keep the UK public here at home and our UK interests overseas as safe as possible? And that conversation would be, well, we're incredibly pleased that the threat level in this country has come down from severe to substantial. So it's gone from highly likely for a terrorist attack to happen to likely, and that is through the incredible hard work of the teams we lead and the number of arrests and disruptions. We've disrupted 28 28 terrorist attacks. 18 of those would have been Islamist terrorism by ideology. 9 of them would have been right-wing terrorism, a real growth in that business over the last few years. And I'm incredibly proud that we've done something to stop that becoming the problem that it could have become if we hadn't taken firm action. So the growth of extremism, the growth of nationalism, the potential still high threat, because there's still a high tempo of investigations in the Islamist sphere with Al-Qaeda and Islamic State potentially reforming and becoming more powerful in other parts of the world and therefore more able to project their threat. The propaganda that's still online. So my biggest concern is online media and how that is inspiring and inciting both vulnerable people and committed people, but how it's self-radicalizing what we now call self-initiating terrorists to commit horrific crimes. So in the old days, we'd have been countering cells of people who were well-financed, well-directed, well-trained overseas and projecting back in towards Western Europe and other countries. Now we're dealing with people who live here, born here, raised here, who are being radicalized online. That is the biggest conversation that we're having, is how do we stop that happening? And of course, everyone sees the name of my organization as Counter-Terrorism Policing and thinks that's all we do. I also have responsibility for counter-state threats, so counter-espionage, counter-proliferation, counter-intelligence. I'm the prosecuting authority for the UK intelligence community for that, and also for Official Secrets Act, and also for war crimes. So we have a no safe haven policy from the United Kingdom, and if you're a war criminal, you shouldn't be allowed to be a resident in the United Kingdom without us investigating you, and my teams do that as well.
Here's
so
the thing.
All of those conversations.
Here's the thing that's going through my head at the moment. It's quite a lot to have on one person's, and I know you're going to say, but it's a team. But you're the person that's got the national lead for it. And I ask this with all respect, how can you sleep at night knowing that you've got this pressure on you?
So the honest answer to that, Barney, is I don't sleep at night. But the reality is I haven't slept very well since I was 5. I was one of those nighttime readers under the covers with the torch on. My parents would catch me reading books. So I've always been a bad sleeper. But yeah, I mean, it's a good question, because actually your mental and physical resilience for a job where you are 24/7, 365 days a year on call wherever you are in the world for a terrorist attack, it's a brutal life. I am going to say it's a team effort because, of course, the thing that gives me a few hours of sleep every night is the incredible caliber of the people I work with. So Ken and all of his teams, and the government team that works in security and counter-terrorism, but actually my people. So, my deputies, the people who lead our operational frontline, the people on the front line are extraordinary people doing an extraordinary job. And if I didn't have faith in them, I'd never sleep. But I do. I think they're incredible.
I've got a message from David Hughes. Great to hear from Neil. I'm watching this from Toronto. This is a good one for you. What's Neil's view of Brexit and its implications on his role?
It's a very good one, and it's one that has, it's taken up so much emotional time and energy over the past few years. It's been extraordinary. Luckily, I say we, as in the United Kingdom, the government negotiated quite a good security treaty. there was a point before the very final moment on the final day where we thought, if we don't get the security treaty, it will be a disaster. That's the reality. But more of a disaster for wider policing than counter-terrorism. And the reason I say that is, of course, we have bilateral arrangements with all of the European countries in counter to share intelligence and information on individuals, methodology, cells, organizations, and we can do that bilaterally because it's a national security issue, and that sits outside of the European Union. So in the treaty that was signed in 1949, it was specifically excluded to allow countries to act bilaterally outside of the confines of the European Union. And of course, my UK intelligence community partners do the same thing. So we are still able to access national security information, but it would have been very, very hard without that security treaty for core policing, criminal investigations to be conducted, which have a transnational, transglobal, cross-border issue.
But post-Brexit, Neil, you still feel that the cops aren't going to be unencumbered in any way?
No, they are. There's no doubt about it, that the mitigations from losing some of the tools that were available to us in the European Union, the vast majority of which have been renegotiated. So we've got those tools back. That's great. The tool we didn't get back was access to the European database SIS2, as it's called, SIS2. And that is the database in which all countries share intelligence on criminals. So we're going to have to find, we've found other ways of doing that. We work more closely with Interpol now. We put our wanted missing, our most wanted stuff goes on Interpol notices. We've tried to replicate that, but actually nothing can replicate the speed and agility of that system. So we are going to have to do something to close that gap. And until we've closed that gap, there is a delay between what might be going on in another country, where that individual might be, and us actually being able to see it. And there's a gap for European Union partners in what we put on the system and how quickly they can see who may be traveling from the UK into their area. So it's by no means fixed, but it is much better than it could have been.
So let's go back to terrorism, which is what your purview is. In 2001, it was the Islamist threat. We had 9/11. 9/11 happened, and the focus was on Islam. In a way, it turned to radicalization of South Asian youth. How much do you believe that the eye was taken off the ball of right-wing extremists?
It depends what country you're talking about. So I don't think the eye was taken off the ball. The eye wasn't on the ball. So prior to 2018, the only people who dealt with right-wing extremism in this country was policing. So we had a domestic extremism unit. It was called domestic extremism. We've changed that now. And domestic extremism was a catch-all from effectively non-violent, non-criminal, low-level protest, all the way up to terrorists like Pavlo Lapshin, who set off bombs at mosques and killed a member of the Islamic community. So there was such a broad spread of work that actually you couldn't focus on what was truly important in the national security community. And the vast majority of the stuff that was happening, and I don't dismiss this. I mean, look at me. I mean, I was born 4 years before the National Front was formed. I spent my entire life dealing with racists and thugs. But the reality is that's what they were, racists and thugs, not terrorists. They were never going to achieve the overthrow of a government. They were never going to achieve what the most extreme end, the white supremacists, wanted, which was the repatriation of everyone of colour. They weren't in that space. They were largely people who were very disorganised, very disjointed, violent in terms of they would attack you for your colour or your creed or your religion, and particularly the Jewish community and people of colour had quite a lot to fear, but they weren't going to be active terrorists. So it was left to policing in communities up and down the country to do something about it. There is a big difference that we have seen happening over the last 5 years, and the referendum will have had something to do with it because, of course, it generated a spirit of nationalism, which goes from good old-fashioned national pride, and by the way, I'm one of those people. I'm an England supporter, even if they're playing India or Wales, and I'm half Welsh and half Indian. But I'm born and raised in England, so I passed the old Tebbit test. there's nothing wrong with national pride, but when it becomes jingoism and xenophobia, it has created a permissive environment for the kind of people, the small minority, and they are a small minority of extremists, to become much, much more violent. And we saw the rise of groups who had been pretty fringe and very small, like National Action, who were at the extreme end, who were willing to promote very violent means in order to actually fulfill their ideological agenda, which was white supremacy. So these were terrorists. So after 2017, when Darren Osborne wrote his manifesto, and I don't like using the names of organizations and individuals because I'm in the Jacinda Ahern bracket. We shouldn't be doing that. But when he hit the congregation at Finsbury Park, he put right-wing terrorism on the map for this country, where we knew we had to do something much more extreme. We'd already prescribed national action in 2016. Amber Rudd had done it for us because of the murder of Joe Cox and the fact that they celebrated Joe Cox's murder, reprehensible behavior. And because of that, we were able to target that organization very effectively. In fact, we've imprisoned 17 of their top 20 people. So we smashed that organization because we saw it and we realized it was gaining traction and we took action. So I would still describe right-wing terrorism in this country as a relatively small part of my casework. It's around 10% of my casework, but it is now around 20% of my arrests. It's about 40% of what's going into the prevent space. So the number of referrals coming to prevent and then going on to the government's channel program to try and prevent radicalization. And I think although it's relatively small at the moment, and I can't tell you whether it's actually growing or whether it's because we've joined together with the UK intelligence community and we're targeting it, we're just seeing more of it. So in other words, have we created more racists or are we just uncovering the ones that were already there? But we are definitely doing something about it. But it's still not the problem that we have inherited from the days of Al-Qaeda and then post that Daesh, which is still about 80% of the work that we do.
And in terms of social deprivation, because we know that white Britons, for example, feel that South Asians and black people get the monies to which they're entitled, to which the white extremists feel they're entitled, the jobs, the whole works. How much is social deprivation a key factor in this huge radicalization of the white communities?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be careful because I don't think it is huge radicalization of the white communities. It will depend on what geography you're in. And my chief constable colleagues who police, sort of small, deindustrialized, poverty-stricken towns in the northeast, for instance, would say it's absolutely a problem radicalizing communities here. And those people on the call who've got friends who are, trying to do community cohesion work in places like Bradford and some of the smaller towns, and will know that that is a definite problem. I still don't think it's the majority of the public. I think when you look at all of the polling, this country has become more tolerant, not less tolerant in the 30 years that I've been in policing. And I take some optimism from that. If I wasn't optimistic, I'd be a very bad leader. You should just give up and go home. So I do take some optimism from that. And I think what we're doing to highlight the fact that we are targeting that makes a difference to people's confidence that actually, we have spent a very long time because of Al-Qaeda looking at a very small part, a very, very small part of a relatively small community in the UK, which is the Muslim community. And I get into terrible trouble for this because I don't see Al-Qaeda and Islamic State as Muslim, although academics would say obviously they're using the banner of the Muslim faith for what they do. But I don't see them as representative of that faith. They're not like any Muslims that I know that I would, their behavior is so extreme. It doesn't represent that faith any more than people who are killing in the name of Christianity, who are white supremacists, represent Christianity to me. So that's kind of my feeling about that particular issue. And I'm sorry, I've gone off my train of thought, Barney. So just give me the question again. I'll give you.
No, that's fine. We talked about social deprivation and.
Sorry. So no, Barney, that is incredibly important. So I absolutely think one of the drivers for extremism, and one of the drivers for, and it doesn't matter what type of extremism, whether I'm talking about religious fanaticism or I'm talking about race extremism, is definitely poverty, it is definitely lack of education, it is definitely inequality, and it is definitely a lack of social mobility. I would add to that a lack of integration, so a lack of experience of other people's life experience.
Which is exactly what happened 20 years ago, didn't it, in the Northern riots?
Yes, it is absolutely part of the problem. And if you look at some of the polling from the education sector, some of the people who are really struggling massively at the moment are young white working class boys in areas of high unemployment. You know, they're probably the most disadvantaged group in society at this point in our history. And of course, that is a breeding ground for radicalization and resentment. And if you have certain sections of the media that like to fuel that by selling the myth that everybody of color gets an advantage that nobody else gets, which quite frankly, those of us who of color think is quite an ironic statement to say the least, it is bound to foment that kind of extremist, but it's only, what I'll tell you from my experience is the type of people that it mobilizes to actually take violent action is actually, you'll be pleased to know, a relatively small group. And that has been my policing experience. Otherwise we'd be living in a kind of society where you'd never leave your home.
Yeah. So one of the things that is obviously of concern to you, you've already mentioned it, and it's a question that Dr. Bindi Shah is asking. To what extent can the Counter-Terrorism Unit work with social media companies to close the avenue of communications and propagation of far-right groups and Islamist groups?
Yeah, outstanding question, and something that, given that social media and the rise of social media has been one of our biggest problems in counter-terrorism. So I don't actually blame social media companies. My predecessor, the great Sir Mark Rowley, who's a personal friend and mentor, and part of the reason I'm sitting here, was very good at going out publicly, still is, castigating social media companies for not doing enough. And I agree with them, actually. They're not doing enough, but they are doing so much more than they were, largely at the urging of people like Mark. We've certainly spoken to them. I have a unit called the Counter-Terrorism Internet Referral Unit. They've been working with social media since 2010 to take voluntary referrals and to spot terrorist content online. And the social media companies have been voluntarily taking it down when it's been pointed out to them. Where they can do more, and where in the last 2 years they've started to step up, is use their great might and resources to automatically take stuff down, to see it and take stuff down. So we've been educating them on what that looks like and what they have to look for. They have got to put the resource into actually taking more of it down. Utopia for me is you're trying to post something extreme or explicit or violent or criminal online, and their systems pick it up before you can post it and immediately take it down. It's too late if they've posted it, because it then gets replicated, and if it goes viral, gets replicated millions of times.
Don't you run into the danger? Don't you run into the danger of freedom of expression?
Yes, massive danger. So let me be clear, I deal in the high end of criminal space. So there's no freedom of expression here. The kind of stuff I'm talking about is entirely criminal. So where you get into the freedom of expression place is the grey area between what is obscene and offensive, but not illegal. And then I get into terrible trouble, because as a police officer, you shouldn't be talking about that, Neil. Yeah, that's not your place to talk about it. Well, it might not be, but I see a lot of that. And what I'm telling government and what I'm telling society is it creates a permissiveness in society that's potentially dangerous. And if you think it's okay to speak like that, and let's be honest, social media has amplified that massively. People are saying things online they would never say to your face, or even to a crowd if they were radicalized. The anonymity of being online makes it 10 times worse. But we have to have a debate as a society as to whether we've set the bar high enough in terms of freedom, what is legal and what is illegal, and whether we've set it way too high and that people can get away with things that they shouldn't be allowed to get away with. I don't think freedom of expression or free speech is an unalienable, unassailable, absolute right. There is a responsibility that comes from having the freedom to speak. And that responsibility is you shouldn't be allowed to do harm. Now, we've set a bar that says harm is illegal content. That bar may be too high. And I think we should start talking about what hateful extremism looks like, and whether or not the gap between hate crime that we can prosecute and terrorism, there is a space that we have not yet accounted for. And
So
that's
would
me
be
trying to be
in favour,
diplomatic.
to be absolutely clear, you would be in favour of making it more difficult to say what we really feel. Isn't the danger of that we drive these underground and therefore create fungi which would grow?
Yes. So that is the counterpoint to this argument. So there was a time 6 years ago when I started in terrorism where I absolutely believed that the best thing we could possibly do was put it all out in the open and debate it. And by doing that, we would, the vast majority of people would recognize it for the poisonous rubbish it was and would ignore it. Unfortunately, that time has passed, and it's passed us that quickly. A couple of reasons I'd say that isn't the right solution is, one, we don't have a compelling counter-narrative to some of the hate speech that's out there. We are not succeeding in charismatic, the reverse of a charismatic radicalizer. Who is that? Who's out there talking to give the counterpoint, the argument for the liberal Western democracy? If you could always guarantee that every time something went viral or went into the public domain or went on mass media, that there would be two sides of the argument put, I would agree with you that would be a much better place to be. And that's free speech, but you can't guarantee that. And the social media construct that's currently there creates echo chambers that actually all you get is a continual reinforcement of one part of the issue. So that's what worries me most. I mean, one of the most powerful things I ever saw was Nick Griffin on Question Time being taken apart by the audience, the panel members, and the chair. It was actually reported in some papers as unedifying. It might make him a martyr. Actually, his party disappeared without a trace very shortly after that, because I think people recognized for what it was, shallow, hateful ideology with no substance behind it. If we could do that every time there was a radicalizer out there, I'd be saying, let them stand up and speak. We have not managed to do that. And my final point, I promise, is at the moment, we've got social media companies largely registered in the US where they have First Amendment freedoms that make it impossible to have this conversation because they have a much, much higher bar, which allows them to speak very freely. The people who are deciding what goes on those forums, what is published, what is there in content terms, is a very small number of corporate players. Now, I'm saying that the decision about what should be on those sites is probably not a matter for 6 people in 6 major companies. It's probably a matter for society to debate with its democratically elected politicians, not for law enforcement to debate. I will enforce the laws I'm given to enforce. It is for society and politicians to debate whether they've got that balance right and to put pressure on social media if they think they haven't. And by the way, over the last 3 years, the government has seen fit to do precisely that, joining with governments around the world to do that. And that is a big...
Neil, look, here's my thought on politics and politicians, and I'm neutral on this, but we've just had a report, the CRED report, which says that institutional racism doesn't exist in Britain. Are you of the same view?
No, I don't agree with the findings of that report. I mean, I'm not sort of... Yeah, I was slightly disappointed that a report was needed in the first place. I'm kind of in the space that the recommendations in that report could have been written 30 years ago. So if it doesn't exist, why would you need those recommendations? The tone of the report is wrong. And I'm completely apolitical as to that's not the point. And as a senior police officer, of course I have to be apolitical. The point is it's landed very badly. So it's, it is very difficult to see how that has moved us forward in any way, shape or form. And I thought I have to be honest about this, one of the worst things I've seen in recent years was the unedifying sight of 2 impressive senior black female politicians shouting at each other from across the dispatch box. I thought if that doesn't put back, the cause of equality and diversity and inclusion years, nothing else will. And it's all as a result of a report with the wrong tone.
You're talking about Kemi Badenoch and her shadow opposition.
Yes.
The debate that was earlier this week. unedifying it might have been, but doesn't it show the actual divide that exists? And has it put policing back as well for you? Has it made it more difficult?
Well, in all honesty, I'm not sure anything could have made it more difficult for us. Post George Floyd's killing last year, and now, well, it's awoken a lot of chief constables' eyes to the incredible confidence gap in the Black community. And that's not the whole community. But, if I talk to Afro-Caribbean young men, their confidence gap in policing is very large and not closing, it's widening. So what it has done is open people's eyes to we need to do something much better and more effective and take some action to close that gap. And there are all kinds of initiatives. In fact, I'm sitting on the inaugural National Police Chiefs Council board next Tuesday to discuss the action plan that chief constables have put together to actually do something about this. It's only the second time in my career. The last time was a young sergeant when the Macpherson report was published in 1999. It's the second big turning point in race for policing that I've seen in my career.
Where do you see institutional racism in Britain? What examples do you see?
Well, I see the fact that it's very, very difficult to get on in some professions.
Including the police, because, as I say, you are the highest ranking police officer of colour. You're of chief constable rank. Since Mike Fuller, there's not been a Black chief constable. Britain thought that we would be in a position where we would have this as a norm, just as female chief constables. That hasn't happened.
Yeah, and by the way, we don't have enough female chief constables either. So it hasn't. So you're answering your question really is it's very visible that there hasn't been that kind of change that we would have expected to have seen in society. So I am an optimist. I told you before, I'm a leader, and you have to be optimistic. I absolutely side with Obama on this. When he left the White House, his comment that if you wanted to be born at any time in history and you were a woman or a person of color, when would that time be? And the answer to that is now, today, because my upbringing was much harder than that of my children. And my father and mother's experience in this country in the 1960s was far harder than mine. That's my anecdotal evidence that actually it isn't as bad as it was. And the fact that Mike Fuller got to where he got to, that I've been here, Tarek before, Pat Gallen were ACs before me, it is possible. There was a time when it was impossible. My point is the speed is not enough. I feel somewhat sorry for people like Mike Fuller, and I feel sorry for Obama, and I feel a bit sorry for me. The idea that a single individual reaching the top of their profession is going to make a phenomenal difference to society is a bit too simplistic, I think. Quite often it creates a backlash. I think Obama's presidency for him created a backlash in the United States. And I think it was part of the reason for Trump, and it was part of the reason for the very, very obvious rise in national xenophobic far-right activity in that country. So I think...
May I disagree with you on something, Neil?
You can always disagree with me, but I've never been shy before.
An individual can make changes. What have you done personally to make sure that you've not pulled the ladder up behind you? Because that's the big problem here. We know that there are people of colour who pull the ladder up behind, just as women do.
Yes, it's a good challenge. So I don't think I've pulled the ladder up behind me, but do I think I've done enough? No, I don't. So I came here giving a speech, having just given a speech inside the Metropolitan Police to 177 mentors of people who are determined to make life better for the people they've been given to mentor, who are all people of colour. So, I'm trying to do something, trying to inspire them to stand up and do something to help people. I mentor a wide variety of people, both police officers and police staff who are women and men and women of colour, as well as male, white, straight people. But I mentor a lot of people. So mentoring, coaching, very important thing. I've benefited from for years. It is the single most important thing to improving people's confidence, network, and opportunity to succeed by a country mile, in my opinion. So I'm trying to encourage more of that to go on. I run a major business group with thousands of people. I have my own diversity, inclusion, and equality strategy. I've promoted the use of equal merit as a way of selecting people. I've asked Cress, and she's done this, and she's getting some traction on it, to go to government and try and get the equal merit law changed so that we can have a policy where we can use that for groups, so large numbers of people when we're recruiting in volume, not just single individuals. It's section 159, I think, of the Equalities Act. And the Met is currently using that policy in its recruitment process. So there's some influence. When in 1998, when the Lawrence inquiry, in 1999, when Paul Condon had to respond to the Macpherson inquiry recommendation, I wrote his response along with two colleagues. So I was a very young sergeant then, 26 years old, I think. And I had the opportunity to influence the management board of the Met as a young sergeant. Now I sit on it, and I'm trying to do the same thing. So I sit on the Equalities Board. I sit on the Equalities Board, the National Police Chiefs Council. I'm not the lead. Carl Fuchs, I'm very proud of this because I'm half, but he's obviously a Welsh Chief Constable. But I'm very proud of the fact that there are other people leading on behalf of people with protected characteristics who don't have to look like me to be the lead. I'm very proud of that.
Here's the thing. So you've talked about what you're doing, and I think you're being very humble. I think the influence you have is enormous. I really do. Neil Basu, the man, when you walk into a police station and you're not as a chief constable, not as a assistant commissioner, how are you treated as an ordinary person by your white colleagues who don't know you from Adam?
I don't know how to answer that, because I'm not I'm 53 years old. Having lived the life I've lived, I've developed a very thick skin. It's one of the lines I use in the speech I've just given is you have to have very thick skin if you've got dark skin. So I don't look for those microaggressions and slights and faults that some people think you will get. And I'm talking in 2021, but I joined, I applied in 1991 and I joined in 1992, and I've been in it ever since. And I've had very little of that kind of behavior to my face from white colleagues, and many of whom did not know who I was. And I've been a detective most of my career, so I wasn't always in uniform. So I walk into.
About you, what is it about Neil Basu who gets on with people and has not faced racism in the police force? Or have you faced racism and discounted it?
I'm also very large, so most people don't. You probably can't tell on here, but I'm not easy to intimidate. So, and I wasn't when I joined the police. And I've got quite a smart mouth on me, and I'm quite bright. So if you want to take me on, have a go, but it's quite difficult. And I was born and raised in a team sport culture. I've been playing competitive sports since I was 5 years old, mostly in white male teams. So you kind of learn to look after yourself. So I don't, put it like this, I don't project the image of a victim very easily. So, but of course, police officers and policing as a profession is full of big, sporty, challenging, outspoken people. I don't know is the answer. Is some people get picked on more than others. I will tell you now, I've got an anglicised first name. I've got an unusual surname for Britain. We all know it's not unusual in the Bengali community. It's unusual in Britain, and certainly was when I was growing up. So people don't immediately place it as an Indian surname in UK culture. I don't have an accent because I was born and raised in the Potteries. I used to have quite a good Stoke accent. I don't have it anymore. A little bit, particularly when I go home. But so I don't fit there. They don't understand who I am, where I'm coming from, what my background is, until I tell them. They do obviously sense that I am not white, but they don't quite know what it is. I've been mistaken because I was a rugby player for years. People used to think I was a New Zealand Maori. I've been mistaken for being oddly Mediterranean or Italian. So I don't think, but when you ask, have I ever experienced it? Yes, I have, but mostly behind my back. Mostly, and there's an example I use from when I was at training school when they were trying to find somebody who would be on the front cover of a Home Office magazine to sell policing as a profession to graduates. And by the way, Southampton was my number 2 choice. I'm sorry I went to Nottingham. I so wanted to say that on this call. I looked at both. It was a marginal decision. I ended up at Nottingham, but so I'm so sorry, Southampton. I love you. So they're looking for somebody to be the cover of the magazine, and of course they want it to be somebody of colour. And the commandant at Hendon at the time was in a meeting with some instructors saying, who have we got in the latest intake that we can put on the cover of this magazine? And all I remember, and there may have been more of us, but there were so few of us in the police at the time, on an intake of over 300 people, there was an Indian woman, a turban-wearing Sikh, who was a very good friend of mine called Raj Kohli, and a black Afro-Caribbean police officer. He didn't want any of them. They weren't acceptable. I was the acceptable one, mainly because I wasn't wearing a turban. And he said that in front of my instructor who was in the meeting. So I know it happened because my instructor was a bigger hero than me. Her name was Farida Holderness, and she, I think, was the first Asian sergeant in policing. And she came straight back to the classroom and said, if you agree to do this, I'll never speak to you again. And I thought, because I was obviously being used as a token, but the only acceptable token to the commandant at the time. And I thought, your point, are you going to stand up and be, if one other person joins policing who looks like me because they saw me on the cover of that, you should do it. So I did it. And what I'm slightly depressed me is that for the next 5 years, only 3 people of colour out of 300 or 400 people hired were hired in the next 5 years. So my first attempt at being a role model didn't work out well, Barney, but I was determined to do it. But it came from what I would describe as, racist behaviour and attitudes.
There is this idea that Black and Asian police officers are disciplined disproportionately compared to white colleagues.
It's not an idea, it's true.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because there was a shocking case, wasn't there, of Superintendent Robin Williams, who didn't open an attachment but still got fired from the police. When you hear of events like that, does it sadden you? Do you think? What do you think?
It's difficult for me to talk about individuals and individual cases. It's a bit unfair because I don't know the full investigation behind that. I will say I do know Robin Williams. I did work with Robin Williams. I thought Robin Williams was an incredibly good police officer, but I don't know the full circumstances of the case. I've purposefully not gone into that in any detail. It saddens me, as it always saddens me when there's a case, because the reality is, Barney, is some of those cases are true, as they would be for any other person, and some of them are disproportionate. And it is very difficult.
If they are disproportionate, Neil, what can you, as a senior police officer of colour, do about it?
Well, I could make myself head of professionalism and do something about it. The reality is I can't do a great deal about it unless I decide to investigate all of those cases myself, and I've got 900 terrorism cases to investigate. So I do get very kind of worked up about the fact that I wrote a report for the Deputy Commissioner in 2012, which was called the Diversity Health Check of the Metropolitan Police in the 20 years post Macpherson, which was very unedifying reading because, all the same things we're talking about today, 9 years later, were exactly the same then. And one of them was disproportionality in grievance, employment tribunals, and misconduct proceedings. It took us many years to come up with, we're going to have to look at every case that's put up and review it and peer review it and check it again to check whether it is a proportionate response. So we brought that policy in. And my head of professionalism and counter-terrorism was one of the people who helped bring that policy in. So I've supported that policy. That's what we've done. Is it making a significant difference? Not yet. There are very small numbers in my part of the world. So I check this in my part of the world very closely. But it's not really affecting my part of the world because the numbers are so small. So I can't give you any statistical significance. Across the whole of the Met, it's still disproportionate. And I think there are 2 reasons for that. But only thinking, I can't prove this. This is a university and there's a professor and a doctor on the line. So and my wife's a doctor and a proper research scientist. So I can't back this up statistically, but I will tell you there are two reasons why these things are disproportionate. One is the fear of white supervisors in managing an issue with a black or brown colleague. So they don't want to be accused of racism. It is much easier for them to say, could professional standards deal with it? Because I'm a manager, I'm nervous about dealing with it because I'll get accused of racism. So the kind of way that they would deal with a white colleague is completely different. They'd have a proper management conversation with them, probably a very forthright one. And they'd think that that was fine because they wouldn't anticipate that they might get into trouble on the back of it. The second reason, I think, and I've had conversations with supervisors who told me these things as well, so anecdotally I know it's true, they will feel that they are obliged to deal with this person as robustly as possible because they're not scared of being taken out for racism, because all they're doing is treating this by the book. So they are, and what they then do is it becomes disproportionate because they're trying to prove a point that they can supervise without fear or favour. And both of those two things lead to the same outcome, which is an individual who should have had a quiet word because they've made a mistake, or they've said something wrong, or they've done something wrong, or they should have had a warning, getting higher up into the misconduct chain. I think that's the reason. Now, when I say to colleagues in the National Health Service, what do you think happened in the National Health Service? They say exactly the same thing to me. And that's a much bigger employer who did exactly the same survey and came to exactly the same conclusion. The reason this was happening was because our white supervisors don't have the confidence, the training, the experience, the behavior to understand what they're doing. And some of that's unconscious bias. I know that's an unpopular term, but it's true. Some of it's unwitting prejudice, but some of it is because they are reacting in those two ways. And we need to train not to behave like that.
When you let Cressida Dick know, because I'm sure you've had that conversation, what has she said to you in terms of that she can do? Because you as a senior officer have the top cop's ear.
Yes, all our management board colleagues do. So what Cress does is she has a completely separate management board for inclusion, diversity and equality. And the management board sit around. We're not dealing with the money. We're not dealing with the bureaucracy of the Met. We're dealing with these issues. And we sit around, at the moment, it's kind of, I think it's, we're on our 4th or 5th meeting post last year, which is precisely to discuss these policies. So there is a whole plan of action in the Met, which includes what I've just described in terms of trying to stop disproportionate outcomes in both recruitment, retention and promotion. And by the way, they've managed to do this in promotion. So you've got just as much chance of being promoted if you're in the process as a woman. In fact, you've got a slightly better chance if you're a woman, or you're black or brown. So there is some equality in promotion. There is still not equality in retention or proportionality in retention. There is still not proportionality in discipline. But the point is, there are action plans, including the checks and balances and review approach I've just described, and the training of individuals to try and reverse that. So I'm really pleased I sit on a management board that is taking action to stop this. You know, I mean, for me, that is anti-racism. That's the definition, is I'm not sitting around talking about it and saying what a terrible thing it is. We're actually trying to do something to change it as a board. What depresses me is we should have been doing that 30 years ago, and we should have been doing it every day for 30 years. And we might not be having the same conversations again, making the same recommendations, seeing the same things. And now we've all become a data-led, we're terribly influenced by academics. So we're an intelligence-led organization that needs to be led by the data, which leads to a conversation every time we want to take action. We won't do it until we've got a very data-rich picture that tells us it's a good thing to do. And sometimes I think that paralyzes us.
Neil, I'm going to be crucified if I don't ask you a few questions from the chat. So let me start off with the first one, which is,
unfortunately.
Okay.
So,
let me read it to you. Professor Jenny Fleming says, does COVID-19 lockdowns, how much has that provided opportunities for radicalization?
Well, the answer is I don't yet know, but I'm on public record as saying it concerns me greatly. I think the media characterized it. They were quoting me accurately. I called it a perfect storm. So you've effectively got the potential for mass unemployment, austerity and financial hardship for the foreseeable future, potentially. the economy could bounce back. I hope there are no economists on the line. It's been a long time since I studied economics. It will be a hell of a bounce back if it happens. So there is that potential, creating that poverty and that causal factor, one of the causal factors. The other thing is we have seen, this is a fact, a big growth of propaganda online. So lots of extremist material, lots of radical material, lots of content that we're trying to remove that's illegal. There's more of that online than ever before, and particularly in the right-wing space where they've become very adept at using social media. They've learned from Islamic State, who were the first people to really industrialize it. And that combination, when people have been locked in their houses with nothing to do but stare at these screens, that's the perfect storm. And I don't think we will see the consequences of that for years to come, but we will see it.
How do you see police force strategy could make use of artificial intelligence and methodologies? Asked Vivek Kumar.
Well, we're looking into this a lot. I wonder if anyone's listened to or get the podcast of Jeremy Fleming, who was giving a Briscoe lecture today on this very subject. And, you know, the ethics and the use of artificial intelligence in the future in national security, but also that obviously in crime and policing. There's a lot of sort of ways of describing artificial intelligence. So if it's machine learning and robotics and automating processes that are currently done by humans, it has a massive potential to free up resource to actually concentrate on the sharp end rather than spending hours and hours. So if we talk about it in robotics terms, I have a digital media tool that means I can use advanced analytics to look through media in 1/10 of the time that it took me last month. It's just come online. So that's a fantastic benefit, obviously, because I can see risk much quicker and I can take action much more quickly. So great. If we're talking about spotting the triggers where people are going to start mobilizing towards violence by taking massive amounts of bulk data and then using artificial intelligence to look at that and come up with Mr. X or Mrs. X is going to be the problem, I think everyone on this call will know that that could create some real problems.
Sounds like Minority Reports, doesn't it?
Well, it is.
Minority Reports with Tom Cruise.
That's exactly what it is. So you are looking at it. That's slightly different because, of course, there was a supernatural being who could so slightly different.
You are that person.
Yes, I love that film and I've watched it many times. But obviously, I also like science fiction. My eldest brother got me hooked on it when I was young. So if you look at iRobot, if you look at Minority Report, if you look at the Terminator franchise, and you think about what artificial intelligence that actually starts to create its own decisions and make its own, if that is possible in the future and we allow that to go unchecked, that is a very dangerous place for the world to be. And there are people genuinely, quantum computing will allow a speed of processing that we can't possibly imagine in the future. And that could bring with it great benefit, but great harm, depending on who is creating the product, who is starting the algorithm. If you put bias into the algorithm, you're going to get all kinds of perverse results. My view from the national security community is I work with, I know the public won't believe this generally speaking, although the British public are very pro its intelligence and policing community on the whole, and do trust us. But actually, I've been amazed working with the UK intelligence community at just how carefully they consider the ethics of what they do. I think we do that in policing much more than people realise. Proportionality, legality, accountability, necessity, the Human Rights Act. It was drummed into me as a sergeant in 1998. When the Act first came along, we were trained in it. I've spent 20 years of my life giving the most intrusive authorities to do the most intrusive things to human beings to try and stop them causing death and mayhem to people. But I've done it always with the back of my mind saying, is this the right thing to do? AI could take all of that away, that human decision-making and values, if we're not careful. Is my view. But I don't know enough. I can't turn my smartphone on, Barney, let alone talk quantum computing.
Well, so. I put my hand up to that as well. Look, we've come to the final question, which is from Jed Lai. And let me read it out word for word. what is your opinion, not on the effectiveness of detection, which is demonstrably very good, but on the effectiveness of dealing with perpetrators of serious crime and terrorism in the UK, which seems to be poor?
I'm not sure I quite understand the question.
Look, so the detection is good, but actually stopping the perpetrators seem to be poor.
Yeah, I mean, forgive me for sounding a little bit defensive, but I've stopped 28 attacks. There have been 12 attacks successful in the 6 years I've been in CT. And every single one of those lives with me every minute of every day. Anyone who saw me give evidence at the Manchester Public Inquiry, and I'd given many speeches since 2017, where I was Mark's deputy and my sole responsibility was preventing attacks in the UK, work with MI5, prevent attacks in the UK. My 4-page job description comes down to that one line. And there were 5 attacks and 36 people died. And there was a time, although I'm getting old, where I could tell you their names now. And I do think about them every day. And my lawyer, before I went to the Manchester Public Inquiry, says, you can't say that. That's just not true. Nobody feels like that. I do. I took this job to stop there being more victims. And in the time that I've been in counter-terrorism, we have stopped 28 plots to kill people in the UK. So we are quite effective at stopping them. When you consider there are tens and tens of thousands of people who are potentially dangerous, but may just be keyboard warriors, they might not actually be, and we have to make judgments every single day about whether that is the person worth putting our resources against, or whether it's that person, or whether it's that cell, or whether it's those people. There are people making those fine judgments every day on behalf of 65 million people who are castigated when they get it wrong. And very, very, very rarely do you hear about when they get it right.
As I think it was Ken McGuinness said, wasn't it? The police, Martin McGuinness, who said the terrorist needs to be lucky once, the police and the security services every single time.
Yes.
Neil, I could talk and talk and talk. We haven't even covered your childhood. We haven't covered your parents and how they weren't allowed to walk hand in hand when they were in love and a couple. When your parents came across. I could talk to you forever. I wish you every success. I think you are absolutely inspirational, and what you've managed to do, and your frankness, your insights, and your honesty, I will never ever forget. Thank you so much for attending.